which if we had to do, now, nobody knows that. These are not dollars that were paid for. But had they been, the opportunity cost, had they been paid for in terms of getting slaves or people to do that work for you, would have been a huge amount. Now, without those slaves, the bees and the butterflies and the bats, we wouldn't have food. So there is no business person and indeed no citizen who can run away from the need for biodiversity. So we've got to look at both things. How do we live on a planet which is a living web, as Wangari just said, in which every aspect is really conditioning the quality of our lives? And at the same time, how do we make sure that what we do to make a good life doesn't reduce its potential for our own selves, literally within the next quarter, or within the next election, depending on whether you're a businessman or a politician, and worry about what happens to our kids. That's really where the whole thing hits.
We'll just go to our next speaker. Maybe I can pose a thought anyway, is that, I mean, there's a lot of talk right now about large corporations around the world and governments encouraging something they call carbon capture and storage, and obviously fitting technology to the top of power stations, taking the CO2 out and burying it in the ground from whence it came. But then there's a very tried and tested method of carbon capture and storage, and that is the world's forests and soils. I mean, they've been doing it for millions and millions and millions of years. They do it very effectively. And I suppose the fundamental question is, why would you not put all your money into the natural solution that's tried and tested, has no liability issues attached with it? In other words, if it's with the carbon capture and storage in the technological way, if it comes back out again, who's liable? Why would you not do that? Why would you not invest in nature? And with all these multiple benefits we're told about water and biodiversity and these things, is it because it's just a small number of high-tech companies that can control the technological fix, whereas the forests and all those other things, it's far more complex? You have to deal with wider groups of people, different stakeholders, I suppose is the phrase. What is it that drives our economy one way or the other when it seems blindingly obvious to some that nature has the solution right there on the shelf versus the high-tech one, which governments are struggling with and spending billions of dollars on, even trying to perfect and thinking about the liability side?
Before I answer that, Nick, first of all, apologies for getting up on the stage late. And to everyone, I'm Jonathan Caledon with the Nature Conservancy, the International Conservation Organization. And we don't have a presence here in Korea, but are located around the world. But this issue of business and biodiversity and what's happening in terms of biodiversity falling through the cracks is a very interesting one. In this morning's discussion breakout group on water, and I run one of the Nature Conservancy's international water programs, we talked about the tenets of environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social equity advancement. And I've got to say, as I look into the future, 20, 25 years from now, my true concern, it's right along the lines of what Sir Richard said, which is that we have the intelligence and the tenacity to come up with solutions, I think in many regards, for our own species. But it is the other species on the planet that are going to suffer. And in the freshwater arena, certainly, our freshwater species are already suffering significantly. The indices on every continent since the 1980s are that our freshwater species are in serious decline, and it's a result in part because of the human-centric approach we bring to answering our environmental solutions. But on this issue that you've just raised, Nick, and returning to one of Ashok's points, about the value that we place on biodiversity. Bees are a perfect example. We don't think about the need to pollinate until we've got an agricultural crisis on our hands in one place or the other. Know that I was in Australia several months ago with Timbercore, which is Australia's biggest agribusiness. And last year they spent $8 million bringing in bees to pollinate their almond and their olive groves. Okay, $8 million because of the shortage in bees in the Murray-Darling River Basin. Okay, another aspect of why business doesn't take biodiversity more seriously and try to place a value on it. Frankly, despite the magnificent accomplishments of humans as a species, we know virtually nothing about biology. Okay, and I'm not trained as a biologist, I'm trained as a lawyer, but I feel confident saying that. And here's a perfect example of that. Are there any marine biologists in the audience? Any marine biologists? If there were, marine biologists I know would agree with me. We know much more about the moon than we know about the deep seas, okay, on our own planet. And the reason for that is really beyond me, but we have done such little exploration of our deep seas that we don't know about. We know that our deep seas are extraordinarily diverse in terms of biology in a very subtle way. There aren't things like redwood trees or elephants that will knock your socks off. But at the same time, our deep seas are remarkably diverse from a biological perspective. But we know absolutely nothing about it and don't know what its value to us and to the planet is.
Well, you raise obviously some important points there. I mean, I was always struck by a project that UNEP launched with funding from the Global Environment Facility some years ago, which was a project that's just literally come to an end in about 9 or 8 developing countries, which was looking at something called below-ground biodiversity. These are some of the beetles you're talking about. Because, of course, everybody thinks what's there in the rainforest and all the pretty butterflies in the canopy and things like that are somehow to do with the surface. But, of course, we know it's the topsoil. And there was a fascinating example from, I think it was Sri Lanka, where there was an old tea farm where they'd been growing tea for 100 years, and they were putting more chemicals on and plant hormones and pesticides and all these things, and the yields had stopped, and the yields indeed were going down. And the scientists went to the forest nearby, which had been the original landscape. They dug up the beetles and the wiggly worms and the bugs and the bacteria, grew them up and re-injected them back into the soil of the old tea plantation, and the yields started going back up again because they'd restored the natural fertility of the soil and all the organisms that were generating that fertility and the health. The question is, if we know something like that, why don't we kind of do it everywhere? Is it because it's more complicated to make a profit out of growing the wiggly worms and the beetles and the bugs, and it's cheaper to just put more chemicals on the soil? Or easier? I don't know. I mean, why don't we take these integrated solutions that we talked about for ages? Is business making the right choices? Are they seeing the world through the right lens? Now, Ravi, that's a difficult one to ask, isn't it? But Ravi Sharma, he's from the CBD, which is a UNEP-linked convention, and it's kind of your year this year. What are your thoughts on all this?
Thanks, Nick. Let me first come back to your first question. I think, not many people would recall that the Biodiversity Convention was signed the same year when climate change was done, and desertification, of course, in 1992. And obviously, everybody knows about the climate change issue very well now, in 18 years, and it's even lesser known.